off-putting. Thank you, Lindsay. And I think one thing that I think we saw from Lindsay there is how paradigmatic the Book of Esther can be, how easy it is to use the Book of Esther as a sense of a conceptual model for something, how easy it is to spot within the Book of Esther the concept of transformation. And I think that part in chapter 4, which often is missed by people in the sort of the dramatics of the story and the splits and the black and white good and evilness of the story, we often miss the nature of the transformation within. Now, I'm interested in politics, as many people will know. Probably I'm interested in politics because in many ways, politics is the realm of influence. It's where we are able to influence our world around, where I suppose different nodes and points of power come up against each other. But if you want things to move forward in a progressive manner, in a better manner, it's often through the political realm that will happen. It's very interesting that after the tragic passing away, of course, of Lord Sachs, I got on Audible. I walked into Coldfall Woods listening to the book Morality, which was his, of course, most recent book. And there, Rabbi Zatzal, it's crazy to say, was talking there about the different spheres of our world between politics, economics, and morality, and how almost morality stands above the world of politics and economics. And my feeling was actually that you need to work them all together. In some ways, you need the influence of the world of politics to be able to expand out the world of morality. Now that is a debate, right? Is morality something that has to be not tarnished by the back and forwards of politics? Or do I need the political world to get involved to be able to bring the values of morality out into the world? So Purim, the Book of Esther, is a book of politics. I think it's really easy to see that. My question really today is, okay, it's a book of politics, but if we look at that book alone as a paradigm, as a model for politics, for us as a people in the wider non-Jewish world, how helpful is that? Because again, it was a relationship between a people in a diaspora setting, right, where there was an element of politics. You can't avoid the political nature of the book, right? The attempt to assassinate the king, the desire of the king to replace his leadership, so to speak, with one person, with Haman, the court Jew, or the attempt by Mordechai to be the court Jew, his being rebuffed in a way by the bringing in of Haman as this main leader, and the process towards Esther in her place, bringing about the salvation of the Jewish people through her influence on Achashverosh. So it oozes with politics. There's politics all over the place. And of course, part of the issue is that the name of God is not in the Book of Esther. We say this all the time, don't we? So it almost leads us to be able to read the book without God, so to speak, which is something very alien to the Bible. So when I talk about paradigms of politics, I'll tell you what I mean. I was thinking about this just now, actually, when it comes to Zionism. Think about Zionism over the last century and the importance of Zionism to us. On the one hand, we think of Zionism and the existence of Israel, the bringing about a state, as a need for us protectively. It's about protection, right? There are vicissitudes in the history of our relationship between the world that can lead to crisis, that can lead to calamity. And the existence of a place, a polity, a state that we can go to, in a sense, is a protection. We talk about the refuge. It is a defensive sense, Zionism, that is there to defend me as a Jew, whoever, wherever I am, if times get difficult in the diaspora. On the other extreme, there is a messianic idea, isn't there? Where the point of returning to the land of Israel is to bring the end of history, to use that term by Francis Fukuyama, right, in the early 90s, the end of history. Literally bring the end and leaving the diaspora, to negate the diaspora. It's about moving away. And what I put in the middle is the idea that Zionism is a transition. It's not simply defensive about making sure we're safe from the other. It's not messianic, meaning that we kick everything off and we move away and we negate the other. It's a transition that is based on Jewish values. It's a working within the diaspora for the betterment of the diaspora. They are three different paradigms. And I want to show how Purim can be understood as one of those paradigms, that Purim can be understood as the politics of defense, the politics of protection from the vicissitudes and the difficulties of the politics of diaspora. And I want to use a thinker called Yoram Chazoni, right, who wrote a book called The Dawn. It was actually updated recently. A fascinating book that was written in the mid-1990s. Yoram Chazoni is one of the founders of the Shalem Center in Jerusalem, which is, I suppose, you would talk about in those days as a neoconservative Jewish think tank. It brought in all sorts of people who were on the right, center right, I suppose, not right religiously, but probably political right, at a time when there were big splits in thought between those type of thinkers and what we would call in those days, in those heady days of Oslo, the post-Zionist thinkers. And there were big debates between these two groups. But I find his book, The Dawn, I'm not sure I agree with it, but I find it really illustrative, because in his book, in a sense, he, number one, looks, of course, at the Book of Esther as a political book. He goes as far to almost say that there is an absence of God, literally, in the story. It's almost a new era for Yoram Chazoni. That the usual model of our books is that we get into trouble, we have difficulty, but God saves us. The model of the Book of Esther, which is new and almost starts a new era, right? The Talmud says that the Book of Esther was the end of prophecy, Sof Nevuah, right? After Esther, there were no more miracles. You couldn't rely on a splitting of the sea. You couldn't rely on some big open miracle, right, that will save us. What you could rely on for Chazoni was the initiative of humans, of politics. And so, whereas we're often told that the amazing thing about the Megillah is that it's a series of coincidences that could only be brought about by God's influence, by providence, and that's a valid approach, and that's a real approach, and there's a Talmudic approach in that as well. According to Chazoni, the real changes that happened in the Megillah are brought about by people who understand the vicissitudes of history, that you need to be on top of things, that a politician needs to be, I think we say in Ethics of the Fathers, haro'et hanolad, who sees what's coming. And incredibly, and I'm jumping here, but I'll come back to it, that means that Mordechai, according to Chazoni, is turned into a Machiavellian character. I'm going to read how Chazoni, if I can find it, quotes the idea of luck or fortune, feminine, by the way, very interestingly enough, he considers it feminine. I would compare her, this is fortune, political fortune, to an impetuous river that when turbulent inundates the plains, casts down the trees and buildings, removes earth from this side and places it on the other. Everyone flees before it and everything yields to its fury without being able to oppose it. And yet, though it is of such kind, still when it is quiet, men can make provision against it by dikes and banks, so that when it rises, it will either go into a canal or its rush will not be so wild and dangerous. So it is with fortune, which shows her power where no measures have been taken to resist her, and directs her fury where she knows that no dikes or barriers have been made to hold her. And according to Chazoni, the Book of Esther follows Machiavelli's message to a point. That's his words, actually, Chazoni. So obviously, there are one or two points that Chazoni feels are really important to this sort of political transformation that is made. Because when he talks about the politics, the Machiavellian politics, he also looks at the role of Jewish leadership and Jewish relationship to that politics. And this is the thing that I find probably difficult, but it probably is real, is that for Chazoni, the paradigm here of politics is the expectation that something, in a sense, calamitous will happen. Something will go wrong, right? And I can't exactly disagree with that. It's not very, I can see the wry smile of Rob Marcus there. It's pretty difficult to disagree with that, given the number of calamities in our history. But for Chazoni, the transformation that needs to happen, and it's a transformation that needs to happen in Esther, is the understanding of her role to be, and this is fascinating related to Lindsay, actually, Lindsay's shiur, it needs to be a transformation to her being an independent leadership individual, leadership role, leadership position, that with that independent sense of courage, she can then influence the king. And so, number one, early on, there is a point made by Chazoni that Mordechai senses the danger in the change of leadership system in Persia. Because what's happened is that in the chapter 1, there are a number of rulers, not just Achashverosh. He takes advice from people. Karshna, Shetar, is all the best. When you've got through those words and you're laying the Megillah, you feel good, right? Karshna, Shetar, Matata, Shish, Meres, Mashna, Memuchan, Shiva, right? All them, right? Sarei, Parasumadai. He takes advice. Achashverosh, who we often think of as this buffoon, he takes advice. And yet, there is a moment when he feels that that advice doesn't help him. And of course, we know what leads him probably to think that way, which is the attempt on his life. Remember, Mordechai already places him in the political structure, places him within, it's a dike, it's a bank he's built by being the one who ensures Achashverosh knows about the assassination attempt by Bigtan and Teresh. But what he does is he replaces a plurality with a single individual. Whereas before, he would hear many voices. And so the Jew could be one of those voices, right? It makes you think of democracy and pluralism, populism, doesn't it? Right? As long as we could be one of those voices, and Mordechai could be, then it was easier to get your voice heard. But once the replacement was made by one individual, Haman, there was no room for any other voice. And so therefore the question would then be asked, why didn't Mordechai bow down to Haman? And this is dealt with by rabbis. What was it that he should have? Why is that? Why put the people in danger? Why put yourself in danger by bowing down to Haman? And Chazoni's understanding is that he wanted to resist the dangers inherent in this change of structure. Because what he saw was that Haman was, in a sense, being placed by Achashverosh over God, right? The Melech Shelamata, the lower king, was being supplanted over the higher king. And almost that meant in Mordechai's eyes that Haman was making himself into an idol. It was therefore clear that he should not bow down to him. So already Mordechai sees the danger, and it comes to fruition because, of course, the anti-Semitism that we know has been expressed by Haman comes through, and Ahasuerus listens to him. And of course, we then end up with this critical piece. And I'm really pleased that, I've done this after Lindsay's shir as well, because I just think every time I read the Megillah, that piece, just the piece in the middle, maybe I'll show it again, of the Megillah is just, if I can find it, of course, so critical. There you are. There it is again, okay? Vayomer Mordechai lehashiv el Esther, right? Again, so Esther, right, does not want to go to the king. She's in an absolutely really important position here where she can influence, and yet she doesn't use it. It's hard. She worries about her life. It's not done. You don't go right. She says that if I can go up in any way, she says those words, doesn't she? All the king's courtiers and the people of the king's courts know that if any person, man or woman, enters the king's presence in the inner court without having been summoned, there is but one law for him, that he be put to death. That's how it was done. She knew the rules. She knew that however much she was a queen, however much that she was in a place of leadership, and this is not now talking about the femininity side of it, she was in a servile position. She was a servant, and Mordechai was too. Mordechai had no in anymore. It was Haman. So what should one do, or what should the Jewish individual do, the court Jew, who has had experience at hearing the ear, right, and having the ear of leadership, knows members of parliament, knows politicians, right? Your board of deputies and your Jewish leadership council, and all, right? At the point when things go pear-shaped, when something is right, immediately he says to her, do not imagine that you have, and I'm using Sepharia here, just that you know, do not imagine that you of all the Jews will escape with your life by being in the king's place. On the contrary, if you keep silent in this crisis, relief and deliverance will come to the Jews from another quarter. And it's interesting that Chazoni, again, similar to how Lindsay mentioned, this isn't just about God saving the people. This is about the fact that there will be others who will take the role. There will be others who will take it upon themselves, while you and your father's house will perish. He doesn't just mean here that they will die. Tovedu means they will be lost. They will have lost their role. Right? They will have lost their role of becoming independent, brave, courageous influencers. So let me just stop the share now. So that means that according again to Chazoni, and by the way, he criticizes Joseph in this. Joseph gets a real whacking. But I mean, you think of Joseph as the holy, we talk about him as Yosef HaTzadik. Oh, no. Because poor old Yosef, the one thing he should have been able to do is bring the end of our enslavement, or at least stop the potential for us being enslaved. But he doesn't. And in fact, right, our pleasure, Mark, and in fact, there is a bit where he goes to Pharaoh to ask for his father to be buried in the land of Israel. But he doesn't go to Pharaoh. Joseph, 25, 8, whatever it is years, has been the man, the individual, the controller of the economy of Egypt. And yet, at the point when he wants to take his father to bury him in the land of Canaan, in what we call Eretz Israel, he doesn't go to Pharaoh, he goes to the servants of Pharaoh. And he says, look, please, if you have found favor, if I have found favor in your eyes, please swear on my father. It's not even about Joseph, it's about the father. It's like he blames his father, that we could take our father up to bury him in Machpelah. And they even have to have a convoy that goes with them, if you remember the psukim there. So it says Joseph loses, according to Chazoni, his bearings as a leader. In some ways, I suppose I might say this with a wry smile, he's not Machiavellian enough. Or that at least is for Yoram Chazoni. And so Chazoni says, number one, and he says this towards the end, The leader needs to invest, right? A Jewish leader needs to invest politically. In other words, needs to make sure he is constantly active at building the protective dams or dikes to the vicissitudes of the political world in which he's in. Always be there ensuring that we can make sure that if crisis comes, we can avert it. Unlike Joseph, but of course, like Mordecai and Esther. For him, it is our human initiative that matters. Now, that's Purim. And according to Chazoni, Purim is actually a continuation of Pesach. The idea for Chazoni is that the paradigm is always about the fear of our place in the nations and the need for our to be protected. And paradigm one, the Torah paradigm, was where God always came in and did that. For Chazoni, a social political thinker, not an unreligious man, he feels that when Purim came about, it was a human initiative. And he's got the sources to prove it too, because in the Gemara and Shabbat, we're told there were two receivings of the Torah. One we know of at Mount Sinai, but we're told, and this is again homiletical, clearly there is a narrative in the Torah about receiving the Torah. There isn't in Purim. But later on, when we're told about how we accepted the laws of Purim, we're told kimu v'kiblu aleihem. They kept and accepted. Says the Gemara, kimu, they kept mashe kiblu kvar, what they already accepted at Sinai. There was a second receiving of law, receiving or relationship to Torah. The difference being, the first was top down and the second was bottom up, to put it that way. The first one was the word of God, the pristine, clear, unescapable word of God. Whereas the second one was human initiative. And he uses that to show this paradigmatic difference. But yet, where God smites the Egyptian, we have to use the initiative ourselves. But there is a different model for Pesach. And that is the model of an American Jewish thinker called Michael Walzer, American liberal thinker called Michael Walzer, who wrote a book here called Exodus and Revolution. Don't be frightened by the title, Exodus and Revolution. And Michael Walzer believed that the Exodus was also a model of politics. And it was a model of politics that found itself quickly into the Western world. And it was a what model, I'm trying to think how best to put it, than of marching through the desert. So the Exodus model is the model of always moving forward, of progression, of bettering, wanting to get to the promised land, but having, in a sense, barriers in the middle. It can go back. There is slippage. You don't always get to the promised land, but you move forward nevertheless. And he looks at this through modern thought. In fact, one of the people that he actually, if I can find it, associates with a love of this idea is a Scotsman called Ramsay MacDonald. Ramsay MacDonald was one of the, he was the first Labour Prime Minister of a minority Labour government, but actually, ironically, considered to be one of the traitors of the Labour Party, because in 29, I think it was, something like that, he went into the, what was the Andrew Margolis knows the year? What was it, Andrew?
National government was 1931.
31, that's right. In 1931, he entered the national government, decimating the Labour Party, which eventually came back, of course, through a man called Clement Attlee, who eventually took it to leadership. But anyway, we'll leave that aside. So he writes in a book I bought, by the way, online called The Socialist Movement, brilliant book, by wearisome journeys in the wilderness, by Canaans, which when yet lands beyond the Jordan were overflowing with milk and honey, but which when conquered were almost barren. And that's what he calls the long drawn out tale of human conquest, which is shadowed by error and catastrophe. And that's fascinating. And so what he talks about here is that Exodus is a model of liberation. It's a model of becoming free. It's a model of free expression. It's a model of value, of a desire for a better valued future. But the idea is that you take your time getting there. So he ends his book, Walzer, by saying, if I can read to you, this is the central theme in Jewish thought, Western thought, always present, though elaborated in many different ways. We still believe, or many of us do, what the Exodus first taught, or what it has commonly been taken to teach, about the meaning and possibility of politics and about its proper form. First, that wherever you live, sorry, Tony Marcus, that wherever you live, it is probably Egypt. Second, that there is a better place, a world more attractive, a promised land. And third, that the way to the land is through the wilderness. There is no way to get from here to there except by joining together and marching. I think that's wonderful words by Walzer. Now, what he does say is that because the promised land is the end point, Exodus politics also bore, is the word I suppose, from it came a revolutionary messianic politics. Because there's always a temptation, isn't there, when you're looking to get somewhere, right, to want to, we'll come back to that, Norma, to want to push the future. Why should I trudge through the desert if I want to get to the end? Let's just push the end. And according to Walzer, that moment that the decision is made to push the end, that revolutionary moment becomes you're either with us or you're against us. It becomes clouded in violence to bring that end. It is dangerous. It is difficult. It can also often be problematic. And so that's, in a sense, where I came to earlier when I talked about these three paradigms. And we know in our modern state of Israel, when it comes to the Zionist progression, you know, it's a bumpy ride. You know, it's really a bumpy ride. I'm a Zionist. And most of us are always never going to stop feeling proud of that. And yet we do worry about things that are happening. We are allowed to be. We know that as wars happened in our history, in the modern history of the state, there were movements who became more and more messianic. This is the end. We can push this end. And so we ended up with, in a sense, what I call the Purim paradigm. The Purim paradigm, which is that, in a sense, there is always a need in our world as Jewish people to be defensive in our relationship to the outer world. We always need to think politically about defending ourselves. If we don't get that right, then we might, in a sense, not foresee, not have things in place for the Haman of the future, wherever that Haman comes from. It's interesting, by the way, as a criticism of Chazoni, because there, I mean, not criticism, it's a source he couldn't bring. There is a source in Masechet Megillah, I'll say it in Hebrew and then translate it. Eina Kadosh Baruch Hu maket Yisrael, ela imkein bara refuah tchila. God will never smite Israel unless he creates the cure already. So you could, in a sense, I'm trying to think of it, you could simplistically, in a coarse manner, say that even although we have the Holocaust in the Second World War, the Zionist movement had existed already, right? Anti-Zionists will often talk about Zionism beginning after the Holocaust, you know, use the Holocaust. We know it didn't. We know it goes back to the 1880s at least. Now, you could say that. I'm not sure I would say that, but it's that type of thinking that already inbuilt. It wasn't simply about human initiative. It needed that human, what we call in the Hasidic world, the hitoruruta dilatata, the arousal from below. It had to be human initiative, but it was noticing those things that were placed, those crutches, those levers that were placed by God in history that we would need at times of crisis. So that's a Purim paradigm. At the other extreme, I've got the paradigm of political messianism. You are either with us or you're against us. There's no pluralism. There's no bumpy ride. There's no transition. It's just we're there now. We've got to do it. And of course, we know in far left politics that messianism exists. In fact, Khazani mentions how religious messianism led to political messianism without God and without religion. It's the same. You push the end by building the settlement movement and creating a greater Israel and a messianic future, or you push the end by creating the international and the removing state borders and creating a communist future, whichever way. That's messianism. It's messy. It can be violent, but of course, it's very, very tempting. In the middle is the model of the Exodus. And what I'm saying is that the Exodus model is not a precursor to Purim. The way we, in a sense, depict it, the Purim model, which is a more historic model, is very different than the Pesach model. But the Pesach model, according to Walzer, is fundamental, essential to our very being as a nation. In other words, and it's an optimistic Rabbi David type of message, I suppose, what worries me is that we, because of our history, will always become defined by the Purim model. And we will lose the potential, in a sense, for transition. We will lose the potential, and I think it's more, for being progressive in our way of working with others in the diaspora. Is it all going to be about defensiveness, or is it also going to be about working with? And I think maybe to end, 9/11, I think that's a good point to end. Maybe it's about creating our relationship with the nations, with society, by using those three prongs of our relationship, three paradigms together. One does not, I think I can use this term now, advisedly, one does not trump the other. God, I feel free to use that word now. One does not trump the other. In other words, sometimes we do need to be Esther. We do need to be Esther and stand up and say no. I don't know, I felt anger. I've been reading the writings of Professor David Miller from Bristol University, and I feel there's a need to stand up and say, no, sorry. No, we use our influence in a way by being quite clear about that is wrong, and we need to defend from that and use the influence we have, but be courageous and brave. But we can't always relate that because we also, I feel, need to show society that as a religion of value, we also are progressive and we want to move forward with society. And maybe the only reason that we can do that is that we have a messianic element. We've got to get somewhere. So I remember Rabbi Sachs, again, Zatzal, writing in one of the essays on the Haggadah, that for him, the concept of Messiah, I found this a really radical statement, by the way. We think of Messiah as an individual. We've been brought up maybe through the Chabad concept that it's a Mashiach, it's a person. For Rabbi Sachs, he looked at it as a navigational star that gets us to a point, which of course is quite interesting because once you get to the point, your destination, you don't need the star anymore. The star gets you there. So is it an individual or is the Messiah an era, a tkufa, a period of time where we've got there? We've got there in the end. And it's therefore not the individual that becomes this absolute massive king-like individual. We need that star to, in a sense, give value to the desert. You need the promised land to give value to the work of trudging through the desert. Because if you don't have that star, that end point, then you might lose the meaning of walking through. And it might be much more difficult when slippage happens as well. So we've looked at, in a sense, Purim as a political document. We've looked at the transformation of Esther from someone who was simply, in a sense, enslaved to her husband, but who was able to take, in a sense, the destiny of a leadership and stand up as an independent individual, well explained by Lindsay, and be able to say, this is how things will move forward, with, of course, the support of Mordechai. We felt that Purim was a book of politics, which was very much about ensuring that we are on top of history through our own initiative, so that we can avoid the pitfalls of our diaspora relationship. But we saw there were other paradigms, one which is messianic, which would want the end now, one which is, in a sense, I look at as a space between, where we march forward together as a people and with society around us, and that we need to consider all three of those paradigms together, balancing them, moving backwards and forwards between them as a diaspora people. Now, there are lots of thoughts there. I feel like I need to work more on them myself. But if you've got any thoughts as well, I know there are questions. I'd love to engage on it. Should we look at questions?
Yeah, you've got quite a lot. Do you want to just read them yourself? Or
Yeah, that's fine. So let's get back to, was there one before? Immediately before. Right, so if you would like the source sheet, no, Esther doesn't ask to return to Israel. Is a message that we need to reconcile ourselves to precarious lives in diaspora. It's very interesting, actually, because so Esther doesn't ask to return to Israel. There are a number of times you get when she's given, Achashverosh says to her, I'll give you everything you want, right? Ad chatzi malchut v'teas, up to half the kingdom. So the Gemara plays on the word chatzi and uses the word chotzetz, ad davar shechotzetz bifnei malchut, a barrier in front of the kingdom. And what was that? The Beit HaMikdash, because there were, in a sense, insurgencies to get back the Mikdash. There's a discussion in Megillah as to, was it the time? Was Daniel's prophecy coming now? Was this the time when we got to go back and build it? Is this the moment? And so Achashverosh fears the same way as Pharaoh, Joseph perceived that Pharaoh would fear if we take Jacob's body back to Canaan, we'll all go. So he only lets the family go. So there's clearly, Israel, as you call it, obviously, clearly was on the radar. So do we need to reconcile ourselves to precarious lives in diaspora? According to Chazoni, yes, we need to be political, or we need to be thankful for the politics. Now, again, I'm terribly, naively optimistic, of course, and I find that hard because maybe because of the person sort of as I am, to only work within that paradigm where you're wily, you're Machiavellian, sometimes means that some things go on which we then lose our voice on, that are rights-based, that are values-based, that are justice-based, because it might be better not to speak about them because we're more worried about defending ourselves. And that's a really difficult balance to do. I hope that relates to that question, Robert. I mean, I'm sure it's not an answer, but Tony, who is Robert's wife, do we prefer the guarantee of divine intervention to the model of political protection given in response to humble supplication, as with Esther's? Okay. Well, the question is, was it humble supplication? I mean, that's one point, isn't it? In other words, she already has said that to go into the king is risking her life, and yet she does it. So yes, I'm sure she was scared, but she still has a bit, it's not just humility, it's realism that this is what's needed. It's hard to answer. That's a really hard question, isn't it? Because this would also probably, I'm pleased by that question, because I feel like I did justice to what I've said, because that's probably makes me immediately think about post-Holocaust theology and the relationship to, the different relationships between, if you read, what's the book, The Seventh Million by Tom Segev, he talks there about, and it's not about the difficulty with which Israelis of the early state found it to relate to Holocaust survivors who came and became part of the state. There's always a difference between, Zionism is so immersed in action, in human action, in building. And the Holocaust was so much about having no agency at all, which is why I suppose the Warsaw Ghetto maybe became the day of Yom HaShoah, right? Yom HaShoah wasn't on the liberation of Auschwitz. Yom HaShoah was placed at the time of the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, because it was an action in the face of the lack of agency. At least we rebelled in Warsaw, at least we fought in Sobibor, at least we blew up the chamber in Auschwitz, right, in Birkenau in 1944, October 44. So yeah, there's no answer. I can't give an answer to that, but I can see both sides of that argument. I mean, if anyone else wants to come in, just unmute and come in. If not, Marilyn asked, but in the end, Mordechai replaced Haman and became the one voice advising or supplanting the king. The politics after Haman remained the same. Whew, that's an interesting one. Did he is a question. I suppose you're right. In the book, he does replace Haman. There's that, as Lindsay related to. He's not fully popular. At the end of the very end, if I remember, of the book, we're told that he was only by a majority of his people supported. Right, Rov Echav, right? The majority of his people. So clearly there's some relationship there to the lack of popularity of him. Now that could be an issue of his own position. Marilyn, it's a really good question actually. Now you're putting these questions are putting me on my toes. There's a halachic question as to why we don't say Hallel on Purim. Why do we say it's a joyous day? We should say Hallel. We don't say Hallel. Now, one answer is that the Megillah is a type of Hallel. It's probably a bit of a cop-out in a way, isn't it, I suppose? But Megillah, Megilta Zohi Kriyata, or Halilta, I can't remember the exact language. The other answer is that we don't say it, unlike Pesach, because whereas in Pesach we came out of Egypt and we immediately were servants of God, on Purim, Akate Avdei Achashverosh Anan, we remain servants of Achashverosh. So that's just interesting to think of that in comparison to, well, what was Mordechai doing? Clearly, Mordechai wasn't a Haman. Clearly, if Mordechai did take that position, he would have thought differently about how things should run. Remember Moshe? Moshe tries to take on all the power and is told by Yitro, come on, you've got to split it up between people. Maybe after the book, Mordechai does bring other voices to bear. Just a thought. Oh my gosh, here we go. Gila, this rivalry between the house of Saul and the house of David. Very interesting point there. Then we've got, thank you, we need to leave now. That's not a question. Norma Brewer writes, the sister of my uncle by marriage was Ramsay MacDonald's secretary, a Miss Rose Rosenberg. There you are. Norma, that's great. It's a small world, Scottish and all. Now, Tony writes here, so we can't depend on rights. And you have to ask, unmute yourself and ask that.
Oh, you're there, so.
Sorry, what did you say?
You wrote here, so we can't depend on rights?
Yes, we have to depend on also whether it's divine intervention or supplication or it's guile or wiles or sort of choosing your gender and being feminine, as it were, and influencing rather than power. We can't depend on rights. Essentially, whichever situation we find ourselves in, we've got a problem. We're not entitled to rights in all these situations.
Have you been reading David Baddiel's book?
No, I haven't. He's basing it on fact, isn't he? I mean, it's
Jews don't
on experience, Jewish experience, isn't it?
I'll tell you something interesting. There's a book I've got here. Actually, I was going to quote it, but I didn't. Called. I don't know if any of you got that. Emma Salon's book, The Pity of It All. Anyone got that book? It's a book about Jews in Germany from 1743 to 1933. So it stops before the Holocaust. But it talks about the Jews of Germany. My mum's parents were German and escaped the war, and I had many a family that obviously died in the war. So Germany is interesting. But there were liberal revolutions in 1848 and 1849. So there was a big move to replace, the Haman rule, right? The rule of the Kaiser or whatever it was then. I can't remember to a more democratic rule. And Jews were involved. There were a number of Jews, right? Heinrich Heine, right, and co, right, were and Ludwig Born, I think his name was. There were a number of Jews that were involved in these democratic revolutions in 1848 and in Baden in 1849. They failed. They were crushed. But also anti-Semitism did not stop either. There were still riots and pogroms after. In other words, it's always this this terribly tragic nexus between good Jews wanting to, in a sense, push the polity on, wanting to move to a better state. And opposite that, often the problem that we are then not counted, as I suppose Badil says, and we still suffer. And I think you'd probably say the same about Leon Pinsker, who wrote a book called Auto-Emancipation in the late 1800s, one of the most famous and important books about Zionism, because he, in a sense, writes that however much we're emancipated and assimilate in the Russian Empire, it still doesn't help. We still suffer. And the only reaction that can solve that is our own state, our own homeland, I suppose he said. I'm not sure he said state, but homeland in Zion. And that was the Chovevei Tzion and the Chibat Tzion movements that were based after Leon Pinsker. So in a sense, that was Zionism as a defense to the inevitability of it, which is the tragic element of our history, given that it started in a progressive movement to a world which was liberation, which was free, where rights were key, where the rights of individuals were absolute and vital, which is the Torah, which is our, so, you know, yeah, I mean, it's sad. I'm saying it's not simple. It's not simple. What I'm saying, though, is we cannot rest on the Purim paradigm alone. If we get sucked totally into the Purim paradigm, however inevitable the calamities are, I think it's a hard place to be. Lindsay asked the question. So the fact that the Book of Esther, according to the Rambam, is the only book that survives into the Messianic era, alongside the Torah, demonstrate that we, the people, as it were, have to be the active participants in our own journey and not rely on God. That's superb. Yeah, that's superb. There is a Gemara about two rabbis that looked at the dawn. Don't remember the rabbis' names. I think Rav Kahana was one of them, if I remember. Looked at the dawn, and they said initially the dawn starts slowly, and eventually it becomes big. Right. In other words, right, and in a sense, that I think the way I look at it is that initial process is the human element, which is then followed by the godly intervention at the end. Right, I'm sort of suggesting that. By the way, it's why we say Migdol and Magdil, because there are two psukim in where is it? One of the Tehillim, I think, is it, where one says that you read it and you write it. One is read Migdol, one is written Magdil, can't remember. And Migdol is the tower at the end, the large light. Magdil means to amplify bit by bit, to grow, gadol, to get bigger bit by bit. It's a very important Gemara for understanding how Zionism was never about all or nothing. The idea of a religious return to Israel was never about, right, it's over, everyone, we've done it, the ingathering of the exile. It takes time. It's a reaction to Satmar in a way, who sort of want the all or nothing, and therefore you can't. So yeah, I think maybe there is a way of calibrating it, that absolutely, that you know, we build the temple, but God then puts the doors in. You know, there's that godly stamp of our action.
Can I ask something? Can I answer? I think also my question was in response to your like trepidation almost of using the Book of Esther as the only political kind of way to manage our journey in the world, and to you've argued for the Exodus, the Yetziat Mitzrayim model, but I'm you know, that reliance on God model, right, with the miraculous abundance of the miraculous, seems to be problematic in this halakha. Like the Rambam, to some extent, rejects that model by making this assumption. It's a question, not, you know.
No, I see it. So what what is tricky is, I suppose, what Michael Walzer does in translating that sort of sound and light show type, big miracle type Exodus narrative that we all learn at Pesach into a political cycle that becomes part of Western thought. And therefore he isn't anymore, once he comes with that interpretation, talking about divine providence. He's talking about this cycle that happens where you, in a sense, and it doesn't always end up going back. The interesting thing with revolution is that revolution is a circle. It's all the way around. Here it doesn't always end up, always at the beginning. There's somewhere, I forgot where he does it here. He actually talks about this, but so, yes, so there you are. I was about to get somewhere and I lost my way. So he talks about it as a cycle. He talks about, for instance, characters like, if I find it, where's Walzer, like Oliver Cromwell. So he talks about Oliver Cromwell and his ideas. Let me see if I find that really interesting. If you give me a second. When you need to find something, you don't find it.
It's a process.
I was just going through this very quickly today. Oh, well. Oliver Cromwell and the fifth monarchists he talked about. And I think Oliver Cromwell, whereas the monarchists, in a sense, Cromwell looked, here we are. Right, so he says here, let me see. So far as the end of the story from the end of the day is that there is more than enough room for the backsliding and renewed oppression that repeatedly transformed the hope of the Exodus into messianic fantasy. Messianism has its origins in disappointment, in all those Canaans that turn out to be almost barren. Yet who can doubt that it is better to be in Canaan than in Egypt, and better to work for one more local deliverance than to risk the terrors of the next to last days? In every revolutionary movement, there are men and women who want to be able to say with Cromwell, we are thus far. And to know, in fact, where they are. For them, Exodus history gives rise to Exodus politics. So I didn't find a relationship to the word Exodus by Cromwell, which was what I thought I would wanted to. But in other words, he's trying to say that the Exodus as a sort of model, as a sort of cycle, has embedded itself in the thinking of modern politics as a transformative but transitional type of politics, which might not get to the end, and is happy with thus far, ad can. We're ad can with that. We've got here with thus far. Yeah. Thank you, though. Is there any more? Rosa Luxembourg, someone just said here. Well, look, I mean, maybe what we'll do is leave it there. I think we can leave it there. I appreciated that, really, to the chance to do that. And I think that I enjoyed that very much because it really worked. I appreciate that you stayed, Lindsay, because, you've got a life and busy, and the fact that you talked to us and stayed, I think is really very nice. And thanks everyone as well.
Thank you, Rabbi David. Let's all give you a round of applause. Nice to be able to do it for you.
And I only hope Hella Mansfield is